All right. Thanks everyone for joining this morning. We have another in the series for our adult ed at Montview. Just a quick note, the meeting is being recorded, so I have chat and audio disabled for the time being. We'll have a quick breakout session where you'll be able to interact with fellow participants. And with that, I'd want to go ahead and introduce Dr. Kyle Lambelet, who'll be speaking today about an ambivalent cloud of witnesses. He's assistant professor in the practice of theology and ethics at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where he both teaches and researches. Before coming to Candler, he worked for racial and economic justice in the Southeast at organizations such as Open Door Community, Greensboro Truth and Community Reconciliation Project, and others. He completed his master's at Vanderbilt and a PhD in theology and peace studies at University of Notre Dame. His first book, Presente, explores the movement to close the School of the Americas. And one other fun fact is that he plays the banjo, mean banjo player. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to him.
Thanks, Adrian. You'll be pleased to know I will not subject you to my banjo playing this morning. But it's great to be with you. Good morning, Montview. I bring you greetings from Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where I am this morning here in my office. And also want to bring you greetings from Holy Cross Episcopal Church, my home parish here in Atlanta. So it's very good to be with you. There are so many losses during this time of pandemic, and I'm sure each of you have counted the many ways that our lives have been changed. But one great opportunity, I think, is to be able to join with family, friends, colleagues, communities of faith across the country in this new Zoom format that we're all learning about. So while I'm sad not to be with you in person, I'm glad to be with you all the same. So a few notes about Zoom. If you're able to turn your video on, we have a small group and it's great for me to be able to see you. But if you can leave yourself on mute during the presentation. This can help cut down on some of the background noise. But also please feel free to use the chat box to submit questions and comments as we go along. I can't guarantee we'll get to all of them, but Adrian will help me keep on track. And if there's a question that comes up, the chat box is a great way to submit it. And then we're going to have a chance for small group conversations early on. So we'll use a feature called the breakout room. And if you haven't experienced this before, it can be a little bit bewildering because you will be zoomed into another room, another Zoom conversation, then zoomed back. But it'll provide us the opportunity to do a little community building even over this online platform. And then finally, I'll be sharing my screen with slides for most of the presentation. So hopefully you're seeing that now. You can use the side-by-side mode if you want to see me as well. There's a little button in the top right corner of your Zoom window, so you can see both me and the slides. So bear with us as we figure out this new format. If there are any questions or concerns, please just drop them into the chat, and hopefully either Adrian or I can attend to them. But that's enough of procedures. Let's get into the work of today. So today is All Saints Day, as you know. Here in the United States, we're maybe more attuned to Halloween than All Saints Day, but and even that probably took a very particular and strange shape in your context. In our neighborhood, I saw lots of creativity. Folks were sending candy down PVC slides, and parents were committing to quarantine all that candy for 3 days. We'll see how much is left after the quarantine. But here's a picture of me last night, stretching back. What a strange Halloween. But Halloween, All Hallows Eve, is prelude to All Saints Day, November 1st. And All Saints Day is one of my favorite holidays. It evokes the cloud of witnesses, a scriptural image that comes from Hebrews 12, and maybe you know this verse. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. So I just love this image from Hebrews 12. I also love this mural that I'm sharing with you here. It's a picture of Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop of El Salvador, assassinated at the altar after standing with the poor. And here also displaying, I think, an important aspect of this season, that it's not just Romero, but the many people of El Salvador who were also killed in a brutal civil war. But it's a beautiful image, this image of the cloud of witnesses, the ancestors, those who have gone before us in faith, cheering us on, supporting us as we fix our eyes on Jesus to live lives of faith, hope, and love toward God and toward neighbor. And in the Western Church, All Saints' Day is part of what's known as All Hallows Tide, a 3-day season that includes All Hallows Eve, so Halloween, All Saints' Day today, and November 2nd, All Souls' Day. And All Souls' Day is probably the least known. It emerged in the 10th century as a way to celebrate not only the holy people celebrated by the Church Universal, but also those largely unknown faithful who are part of our lives, part of the lives of the church. So the holiday fell into a bit of disrepute during the Reformation. Some reformers saw it as far too Catholic, but it's still celebrated in many parts of the church, and I think it's worth retrieving even for iconoclasts and reformers. But altogether, these days of All Hallows Tide, this 3-day season, offers us a time when we celebrate our faithful departed, what we would call the church triumphant. It's a time when we remember those who have gone before us, who've taught us the ways of a holy life, the ways of faith. It's a time to pray with them as they cheer us on in the life of holiness, of justice, of peace, of discipleship to Jesus. So this All Saints' Day comes to us in a significant moment in the life of our country. You may have heard we are 2 days before an election. It's right around the corner now. Can't wait till it's over. It's an election where we've been told that our future, our country, our very lives are at stake. So this may be how you're feeling about the election, about 2020. What a year we find ourselves in this All Saints' Day. So as we turn to the cloud of witnesses, you may have in mind, like me, those saints, those faithful departed who have shaped your approach to faith and politics, to the many issues that are emerging in this campaign season. And furthermore, if you're like me, you may have been paying attention not only to the election campaigns, but also to the uprisings for racial justice that started over the summer and have continued to today. You may be holding in mind not only faith and politics in a general sense, but you may be considering those saints who have informed your understanding, our understanding of race, politics, and faith. That's a lot to hold together, but that's the mess that we find ourselves in on this All Saints' Day. So given this context, I want to spend the next hour or so thinking and talking together about the cloud of witnesses, the saints that have gone before us, with a special focus on this intersection of race, faith, and politics. And as the title suggests, I not only want to celebrate, and there is much to celebrate, but I also want us to invite us to hold our personal, our familial, our national, our ecclesial history with some ambivalence, an ambivalent cloud of witnesses. So just to lay it all out on the table right here at the outset, my suggestion to you today is that this cloud of witnesses across the ages can be a source of guidance and hope as we follow Jesus, as we fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, especially in this work of racial justice that I think is very pressing for us in this time. But, and here's the kicker, we can miss this gift of the saints if we romanticize them or ignore their ambivalence. And in some cases, their real strangeness or problems. So what I want us to invite us to consider today is that, in fact, by dwelling with this deep ambivalence, the saints can become a means of grace for us. And they do this, I think, by inviting us into the messy work of racial justice in the midst of a history of complicity. So here's my plan for the time that follows. First, I want to spend some time as individuals and then in small groups naming some of our saints. What I think we'll find as we turn back to the history of the church is that these saints are a bit more ambivalent than they first appeared, and this is not a problem. This is, in fact, what's most helpful about the saints. Not that they're perfect, but even in their imperfections, that they point us to fix our eyes on Jesus. Second, I want to introduce a few scenes from the history of the Presbyterian Church on race, faith, and politics. And it will be very schematic, and we'll just drop in at a few moments. But what we'll recover here is this ambivalent cloud of witnesses, and possibly some things that might not make us feel very proud of our history. And then third, I want to conclude by offering some strategies for engaging this ambivalent history, this cloud of witnesses that continues to shape how we approach these challenges today. So my aim here is to equip you with some tools for taking responsibility for the present by recalling the past. So that's kind of the hope for these next 45 minutes. And then afterwards, I hope we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. So to get started, what I want to invite you to do is to take a moment and consider this question. Who are the saints, who are the souls that for better and worse have shaped your approach to race, politics, and faith? What did they teach you? How did they form you? So we'll do this first on our own, and then Adrian will help me to set up these breakout rooms. But take a minute now to consider this question. Hold in your mind the person or people that is especially informed how you approach this intersection of race, faith, and politics. Could be a saint known to the Church Universal, could be a parent, grandparent, mentor, known only to a few. Consider what they taught you, how they formed you. So we'll take just a minute to do this individually, and then we'll break into small groups of 3 or 4. And when we put you into those groups, make sure that you briefly introduce yourself to one another. This is a great and important opportunity for community building over Zoom. So introduce yourselves, make sure everybody knows each other, and then introduce your saint. We'll take about 7 minutes in small groups, and then we'll come back to the plenary. So take a minute now. While you're taking that minute, Adrian and I'll get the breakout room set up, and we'll consider this question together.
Okay, I'm about to put everyone into breakout rooms, and so you can go ahead and unmute yourselves, video if you want. Those should be all on the bottom left. There's a little microphone and a little camera type thing on the bottom left. If you hover over it, you should be able to go ahead and enable audio and video now. So we're going to spend some time in the breakout room, and then as time winds down after a few minutes, after introducing yourselves and discussing Kyle's question, we'll give you a heads up that the rooms will close. We'll give you about a minute heads up that the rooms are going to close. All right. And okay, looks good.
All right, welcome back. I hope your conversations were productive. Maybe you met someone new, maybe you saw someone you haven't seen in a while. But I want you to hold these saints in your mind as we go along to get together today. We may have occasion to return to them in the end, but I think it'll be important for us to hold these images, these faces with us as we go. As I've been preparing for this time with you all, I lost two saints, two souls that have in different ways been critical to my own formation with regard to race, politics, and faith. So I didn't know this would happen when I gave Clover the title, but sure enough, it did. So, but I want to share them with you. The first is my grandfather, Miriam Paul Ellis. Here's him and myself, much younger. He died earlier in October last month at 97. Mackie, as we called him, was many things, but he was a faithful Christian and he loved his family very much. He was a child of the Depression, born in 1923, and both of his parents died before he left home. He was a veteran of World War II and taught me many things: the value of humor, presence. He never met a stranger. And Granddaddy loved his wife, my grandmother. He cared for her as she died. He loved his kids and grandkids and great grandkids. And there's much more that I could say here, but I also want to tell the truth and to say that my grandfather was a racist. And I mean this in two ways. First, he was a racist in a general sense in which all white people benefit from the systematic advantages of white skin privilege in a white supremacist society. So, for example, as a white veteran, he benefited from the GI Bill, was able to go to college, buy a home. He had the benefit of easy credit in Kansas City, where he lived, where real estate agents and bankers' preference for white clients made his generation of wealth and class ascendancy possible. But my grandfather was racist in a second sense. He held bigoted views throughout his life that reflected his upbringing in Scotia, South Carolina. He replicated and extended those views into the present. So while Granddaddy was genuinely kind interpersonally, regardless of race, I do believe that to be true, I remember feeling uncomfortable as a child with some of his political statements and jokes. He could never imagine people of color as equals in status or capacity. And then as an adult, his racism became an impediment to our relationship. So while my grandfather was an exemplar of loyalty, of kindness, of ways of being present to family and neighbors, of modes of selfless care, he also taught me ways of being white, of ignoring, obscuring the privileges that accrue due to white skin privilege, and handed down not only a legacy of racial prejudice, but also material wealth gained through white privilege. So an ambivalent saint, for sure. A second person who died this last month is Murphy Davis. Maybe that some of you have heard of Murphy. She died just a couple of weeks ago, 72 years old. She was a Presbyterian minister, co-founder of the Open Door community here in Atlanta, and worked for decades to advocate for the homeless and imprisoned. And I met Murphy when I moved to the Open Door after college. It was for me a pivotal time in the development of my own understanding of this relationship that we're talking about today: race, politics, and faith. Murphy and her husband, Ed Loring, had started the Open Door in 1981 to offer hospitality to the unhoused. They staged several daring nonviolent direct actions, including occupying the Imperial Hotel downtown here in Atlanta and calling for it to be used to house the homeless. They led demonstrations during the development of downtown Atlanta and the concomitant displacement of the poor and the people of color. So I participated in one of those campaigns during the summer of 2005 against so-called quality of life ordinances. And Murphy was ever present, leading vigils against state executions of women and men on death row, of visiting folks in prison. She was a Christian whose life had been shaped in a fundamental way by Matthew 25's call to the works of mercy. And for her, Jesus showed up in the lives of the poor. So I wanted to share a quote from Murphy. Here's what she said in one of her articles: "To love the poor and to embrace the radical gospel is very clearly to choose sides. It's to side with the poor and the oppressed, yes, against systems of the rich and the powerful. It's neither a comfortable nor an easy place to be. It means struggling mightily not to give in to hatred, cynicism, bitterness, and despair. And it means living in hope, always for grief and love to express themselves in joyful, hopeful action." So Murphy taught me that to follow Jesus is to love the poor, and to love the poor is to take up action with and on their behalf. And Murphy taught me this was joyful work, but it's also hard and painful work that meant struggling with and renouncing parts of my past. So Murphy was a saint who struggled with ambivalence and chose to side with the poor and the oppressed. Murphy taught me that Jesus comes to us in the stranger's guise, so pay attention. So here are two examples of my cloud of witnesses. Together, they're ambivalent. And I imagine that you may have had some ambivalence too, as you lifted up some of the ancestors, guides, saints from your past. I don't know who came up in your conversations, but hold on to them, hold them in their image in your mind as we struggle together with the ambivalence of our past. So what do we do? What do we do with this ambivalence? Well, first, it's not just us that may feel it. Let's take a short walk here, a very short walk, 10 minutes or so, through the American church's history on faith, politics, and race. So I want to draw just a few scenes here from the history, especially the Presbyterian Church in the United States. And some of these people and scenes may be familiar to you, some of them may be new, but if you're interested in a fuller recounting of this history, I recommend to you Jamar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise. I have it right here, which does, I think, really important work in collecting these themes of race, politics, and faith into a sweeping historical narrative. But let's start with an early American Reformed saint, maybe the original. Here he is, Jonathan Edwards. John Edwards, the revivalist, the preacher of the Great Awakening. You may have read his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, or his book, Religious Affections. Edwards is justly known as one of the great American theologians, and there's much to say about Edwards, but in spite of his important theological and pastoral work, we also have to tell the truth and acknowledge that all that important theological work did not lead him to reject race-based chattel slavery. While he accepted the spiritual equality of Black and white people, and he discouraged slavery because he thought it would prevent the enslaved from accepting Christianity, he was willing to support it so long as masters treated their slaves with kindness and purchased them legally. So Edwards based his views on experience and reason, as well as scripture, good theological sources. But he came to this nefarious conclusion. Edwards, it should be said, held the conventional view of white landowning men of his time, that as long as it was done legally and with kindness, it was justified, it here being slavery. Edwards owned several people, Joseph and Lee, a woman named Venus, purchased in 1731, listed on the inventory of his estate, a child named Titus, an ambivalent saint, to be sure. Of course, Edwards is not the only Reformed theologian to render a judgment on slavery. Here's another, John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist who took up arms in Kansas and at Harper's Ferry to combat the scourge of racism and slavery. His reasons were theological. He saw slavery as a founding sin of the nation and argued, drawing on sacramental imagery of Hebrews, that, quote, the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood, end quote. He had in mind here not simply the blood of others, but his own blood sacrificed in the abolitionist struggle. So you may know John Brown better from this mural in the Kansas State House. I grew up in Wichita, and went to see this in Topeka. Tragic prelude here depicting Brown as a fanatic. So in a faith tradition animated by both support of slavery and militant opposition to it, the stage was set for schism. So another scene then from this history is provided by the split of the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America, the PCCS, and the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, PCUSA, the denomination with which Montview is affiliated. So it might feel easy to be self-congratulatory that you are on the right side of history here, but the story is more complex. Led by Presbyterian minister Gardner Spring, the 1861 General Assembly precipitated the split of this denomination by calling on all Presbyterians to, quote, pledge their allegiance to the federal government and by implication to its stance on slavery. So the allegiance to the Union became a proxy for a stance on slavery. And while we may celebrate Spring's stand against slavery, his attempt to do so was founded on a pledge of allegiance to a nation founded on racist ideals. Another ambivalent member of the cloud of witnesses, to be sure. Those departing the denomination then made their case on the basis of freedom to serve Christ rather than Caesar, while also defending their, quote, God-given right to own slaves. So Presbyterians like Robert Louis Dabney, for example, argued from scripture for slavery, suggesting that enslaved Africans benefited from their enslavement. He said, quote, was it nothing that this Black race, morally inferior, should be brought into close relations with a nobler race, end quote. So this split was, as those of you who've been in the denomination for a time know, reconciled in 1983, but the complex legacy remains part of the identity of the PCUSA. So this is admittedly very sweeping here, but a final scene might be Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. This is rightly remembered as one of the great texts of American political theology. King made a forceful and compelling case for the violation of law in the pursuit of justice. He argued that Black Americans can no longer wait for moderation and slow change, but the demands of justice were urgent and necessary. And with soaring rhetoric, he declared, quote, an unjust law is a human law that is rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts the human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. So while we often remember the stand of King, we probably just as often forget the occasion of his writing. So he was responding to 8 white clergymen in Birmingham. One of them, Edward Ramage, was a Presbyterian. Their message, the 8 clergymen's message to King, was framed as a call to unity and advised him to wait, trust the long, slow process of social change. They advised against the militant tactics of the civil rights movement, saying that law and order should be respected. Ramage was a particularly ambivalent figure. His church, First Presbyterian there in Birmingham, was the target of civil rights activists. When 2 Black women visited on Easter in 1963, Ramage kindly invited them to come again. He was soon after the recipient of death threats, and his tires were slashed by white supremacists. Receiving King's letter, he would later say, was like getting a letter from St. Paul. Ramage, though, this white advocate of moderation, was eventually run out of his church by segregationists, even though he stood against King. Talk about ambivalent. So a few scenes, all too schematic here, but a few scenes from Presbyterian history on race, faith, and politics. There are many others that we might have explored. Just from the civil rights movement, we might have considered saints like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, or Ann Braden, Will Campbell. But I hope these scenes begin to evoke the challenge of our ambivalent history here in America, in this nation founded on the racist ideals of enslavement of Africans and the dispossession and ultimately the genocide of Native Americans, we have an ambivalent cloud of witnesses. We have those who have fought and given their lives for racial justice. We have those who have waffled, prioritized other tasks. We have those who stood in full-throated opposition to racial equality while using theological and scriptural justifications to do so. So where does this leave us? What do we do with this ambivalent cloud of witnesses? So we're going to turn now to kind of some strategies for engaging this ambivalence. But before we take up these strategies, I want to just ask the question of why. Why even consider history as a resource for our faith? Why not just leave this all behind? Let me suggest 5 reasons. First, engaging history reminds us that we are not the first to encounter the challenges we are facing. Though the specific issues and characters are particular, there are many who have gone before us, have considered and engaged these challenges. We can pray with and against these figures as we keep our eyes on Jesus. Second, by engaging these ambivalent saints, we see that the challenges we are facing are not simply a Southern problem or a problem for people of color, but the challenge of white supremacy is a shared problem. It's a problem that emerges from our shared history. And furthermore, we see that it's a theological problem. It's a problem of and for the church, and we've got work to do. Third, engaging this ambivalent cloud of witnesses reminds us of our own temptations to complacency and compromise. It prevents us from sinking into a kind of self-congratulatory sense that we are on the right side of history while those other people got it wrong. We face the same temptations. And in fact, some of these figures are part of who we are. For remembering this history, for white folks especially, reminds us that the work that we have to do is particular. We need to engage these ambivalent saints, not because we would commend them as exemplars necessarily, but because they're part of who we are. While the work of racial justice is a shared task, as scholar Anthea Butler has said, white folks need to go and get our people. When we hold these ambivalent saints in our mind, like my grandfather, we build our capacity to engage our friends, our families, our neighbors transformatively with both truth and with love. So fifth, and finally, it's in this history, in the engagement with this broken and problematic cloud of witnesses, that we recall God's faithfulness. History does not follow a line of either progress or decline, but rather in history, we see God working in and in spite of our efforts. The cloud of witnesses points us back to Jesus, the perfecter of our faith. So how can we engage this history as a means of grace? I want to suggest 4 strategies that you might employ. One strategy could be a kind of hagiographic retrieval. And there's both a negative and a positive side to this strategy. On the negative side, it could simply erase the difficult details and reconstruct a hagiography of these lives that focus on their virtues. So I could lift up Granddaddy's love and kindness, or Gardner Spring's stand against slavery. I could focus on Edward's religious affections without worrying about his ownership of slaves. This kind of retrieval sorts the good from the bad. And we all do this in our self-narrations and our family stories. We never include all the details. Our stories always involve omissions, those known and unknown, and we could strategically omit certain details. But obviously, this has some problems. There's a massive strategy of hagiographic misremembering in the reconstruction of American history as a righteous and Christian nation. This kind of American exceptionalism is not only historically and factually untrue, but it's theologically misleading. Additionally, repressed details often come out otherwise. In repressing the actual history of our ancestors, our forebears in the church, their complicity in the state of racial injustice in our church and nation, we may be tempted to place all responsibility on another guilty party, such as, oh, well, those Confederate Presbyterians, or those people in the South, or Trump, or the Proud Boys, or someone else. And in doing so, avoid reckoning with our own culpability. Whether we like it or not, these stories, these lives, these witnesses are part of our story, our lives, our witness, and we have to wrestle with that. So there may be a positive version of this strategy of hagiography, however, through the selection of different exemplars and saints. Rather than centering our celebration on Jonathan Edwards, we might find a Murphy Davis or a Will Campbell or Ann Braden or John Gloucester or Katie Cannon. Who we celebrate, who we memorialize, it all matters. A second strategy might be denunciation and rejection. We could critique problematic figures for their complicity in racial injustice. We could simply remove Jonathan Edwards from our theological consideration or dismiss Ramage as a sellout. We might critique these figures by showing how their actions enabled the continued oppression of people of color. And this strategy is critical and important. We need to tell the truth about our past, and some figures are simply beyond repair, beyond rehabilitation. But such rejection can also participate perversely in the same aspiration as the negative form of hagiography. It can seek to purify our personal and collective story. That impulse to purify, to purity itself, fails to keep faith with the ambivalent ways in which we inherit these legacies of those who have gone before us. Both repression and denunciation can be an exercise in an attempt to maintain a kind of purity, of distancing my story from the contamination of the past. In an ironic way, then, they join with the dynamic of racialized purity that obfuscates the complex forces that have created the problem in the first place. So a third strategy we might take up is lament. Lament. Lament is one of Scripture's primary modes of prayer. The Psalms are chock full of them. It's the most common genre of the Scripture's prayer book. God laments over creation before the flood. Rachel weeps over her children. Jeremiah cries out in exile. Job denounces God's abusive sovereignty. Jesus draws from the laments of the Psalms to issue his last words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Laments are prayers at the end of human agency. They confront the reality of our situation and recognition that things are not as they should be. So learning to lament the long and lachrymose history of the Christian church on faith, race, and politics, for me, has meant grappling with this truth. The modes of faith that I have inherited, good rhythms of vocation, of community, of care, are deeply ambivalent, inescapably so. I lament my loss of innocence, my inability to repress or denounce and thereby remove this stain from my story. I lament my own awkward and unearned complicity in the failure of witness against racism. So in as much as I would commend lament to you, lament also induces another sort of temptation, resignation. I might simply throw up my hands and say, my inheritance is polluted, there's nothing I can do. Like repression and denunciation, this operates as yet another strategy of escape, where I refuse to allow lament to do its deepest work. So the scriptural response to resignation is repentance, turning to God who can redeem us, who can convert us toward reparation and solidarity with those ground up by our violence. So a fourth strategy, admittedly, this is my preferred strategy here in this heuristic, but a fourth strategy is critical caretaking. After lament, we might take responsibility by holding the complexity of our past with curiosity. We can wonder about Gardner Spring's attempt to enforce abolition through allegiance to the state. We can see the limits, terrible limits, of Edwards' account of religious affection when disconnected from the emancipation of people from slavery. We can sympathize with Edward Ramage's failure to come to common cause with King, even as he took what he thought was a bold stand. The point is not that any of these is not to get any of these figures off the hook, but rather by engaging them as critical caretakers of this tradition, of this cloud of witnesses, we began to see ourselves with a little more clarity. We see that the drive to purity does not serve our solidarity with the struggles of people of color, and instead that we're called to engage this messy work, getting into the hard, complex, ambivalent vocation of racial justice and healing. So in conclusion here, I want to return to Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. The saints cheer us on toward the life of faith. They are not finally models or mirrors, but they're windows through which we can see new possibilities. They are cheering us on as we seek to do the work of racial justice and healing that is before us. But this is work that requires us to engage with those saints, to engage our history and our past, to remember our own complicity and the complicity that we've inherited. For me, this ambivalent cloud of witnesses reminds me that to rely more fully on God's grace. I'm still a work in progress. I still have work to do in repairing the pain wrought by our nation's history of genocide and slavery and our church's complicity in those horrors. But I take hope. I take hope in this image of the saints, even these ambivalent saints cheering us on, calling us to a more faithful way of living into God's dream for us of beloved community. So we've come to the end of my prepared remarks. I'd love to invite you to unmute yourself. I realize the chat box, my promises of attending to that were false, and I don't have a chat box to connect with you in. But if you're willing to unmute yourself, if you have a question, please do so, or a comment, a reflection as you return to the saints you named at the beginning.
One question I have is about reading on this history. Like some of the most extensive biographies of Edwards might only have a footnote about his stances on slavery, whereas like I don't know where, for example, did you find that like a enslaved child was found as part of his property?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a real puzzle. Another more distant saint, Bernard of Clairvaux, who, if you've read any of his spiritual writings, they're beautiful. His commentary on the Song of Psalms is a stunning work of spiritual genius. He was also an advocate of the Crusades. And if you go to Candler's library to try and investigate this question, you'll find there's a stack of spiritual writings of Bernard of Clairvaux. And then several stacks over, there's a row of books about his preaching of the Crusades, and ne'er the two shall meet. And we kind of keep these things separated. It is a real puzzlement to me that that's the case. And I think ultimately a problem that where we have failed to get at the real gift of these figures. And with Edwards, to your specific question, Tisby talks about it and cites an essay that it's, in some ways, it's pretty schematic. Edwards does not talk much about it, about his stance on slavery, but there is a note that is kind of prepared notes as he's from a letter that has not been recovered, but where he's developing his account of justification of slavery that runs along these lines that I mentioned of if it's legal, if it's done with kindness. I mean, these are very scriptural concepts that from First Timothy or the letters of Peter, the household codes that justify a kind of slavery. So yeah, I have a stack of books here that I'd commend. This Jamar Tisby I found very helpful as a sort of pretty broad and sweeping history, but also a distillation of a lot of historiographic research. I also, as far as Edward Ramage, who I mentioned, this book, Blessed Are the Peacemakers by Jonathan Bass, has a great kind of history of the 8 clergy who King was writing to, which which I found just so helpful and enlightening. I think we justly celebrate King, but we often forget his context and how in his life he was actually a very unpopular figure, especially towards the end of his life. And religious leaders, in the ones we continue to celebrate, are those who stood with him, but many, many religious leaders, many people of faith and goodwill stood against King, saw his activism as militant, as violent. And, you may have heard people say about Black Lives Matter, well, that's just they're so angry, they're so militant, they're so, look at the looters. Those are not new problems that just emerged here in 2020. Those were things that King was working on and engaging. And so we can learn something about ourselves and how we might engage in a productive, supportive way with racial justice in the present by accessing that history.
All right. Any other questions or comments from those of you participating?
I see Tim and Clover trying to get in here.
Okay.
There we go. Hey, couldn't figure out how to unmute ourselves.
Okay.
Great presentation and discussion, Kyle. Thank you so much. This is really helpful and perfect for this Sunday. I was thinking that and for this time, of course, that the ambivalence you're talking about with our saints goes right back to our scriptures, and you've sort of half mentioned that a couple times, talking about arguments about slavery, for example. You can both sides were making their, the abolitionist and the anti-slavery arguments from scriptures, and even that notion of even the biblical idea of justice, I think, is ambivalent. On the one hand, there's this idea of justice that's biblical as a kind of, hospitality to the other, and, preferential, orientation toward the poor and the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. But then there's justice as law and order, basically. That same word mishpat, I think, means both of those things. So it's just it just runs right through our whole faith tradition. I appreciate you helping us think about that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, it's a great observation, Tim, and the challenge for us is how do we hold that ambivalence? I think one of the temptations that I tried to name is a rush towards purity. So maybe we'll just select the passages that make sense and do away with the rest. That's not really what we get with scripture. We get a pretty ambivalent text that has both passages of soaring beauty and consolation, as well as some really challenging, difficult passages. So we inherit all that, and then we try and hold it, and we discern. And what I have found, why I so love this image of the cloud of witnesses, is it's not merely a thing of the past, that these witnesses, these saints, are actively with us, and they are aiding us as we discern what is it we're supposed to do now in this time. And so the saints can guide us, can be intercessors on our behalf as we discern how do we cut through the mess, the deep complexities of our time, our day. And so I think that can be a grace, that can be a gift to us, as well as, I think we can approach the challenge of history in some ways with the same tools that we use in engaging scripture as a challenging text. Now, Edwards had some of those tools right at hand. He was using reason. He was using his experience as tools to understand his day. So those can go wrong too. But we pray for the Spirit's guidance and God's direction as we're engaging these difficult texts, as well as a difficult history that we're grafted into. Yeah, Clover, you want to?
I need to be in, there we go. Well, I think I pray that we won't be judged as harshly as we want to judge our saints of past, because I think with great humility, we are doing what we feel called to do with all we know and the context and resources we have. So I hold all of that loosely or gently, because again, the saints of now, today, I think we're trying, or at least many of us, I think, who are committed to understanding or becoming more aware of our own racism and prejudice and classism and all of that. And I think it's a journey, to use an overused term. And so when I think about the saints of past, I'm so glad they were messy. I'm so glad they were complicated, individuals and multi-layered individuals, because we are. And I think when you do therapy, you start being more gentle with yourself, and then hopefully more gentle with others, both past and present around us. So anyways, I find your words freeing for myself as well. So thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, and all the saints are messy. And I named some folks who I think of as more of exemplars, like Murphy Davis or Martin Luther King. But an important part of my own political development and faith journey was getting to a less romantic version of King, even.
Yes.
We have a very, if he's an exemplar, you think, well, how do I be like him? Well, what a strange thing for a young white kid to think. But if I can't be like King, well, why would I do this work? But King was a deeply ambivalent figure. He held very misogynistic views. He mentioned Ella Baker, who was the first interim director of the SCLC, who really was the one of the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. She could never really get a hearing with King, and while she appreciated who he was and the work that he did, it was the work of Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ann Braden and some of these unsung women who really allowed the civil rights movement to get off the ground. And so what Baker says is the King didn't make the movement made King. But coming to a more mature and less romantic understanding of the saints, I think, as I try to suggest, offers real gift to us in that we're messy and messed up too. And we live complicated lives. And rather than holding the saints at a distance, at a kind of hagiographic distance, we can say, maybe God has something for me here too. In all of my faults and all of my foibles, God might be calling me to acts of courage and works of peace and mercy in this messy world that we live in.
Right, that's right. Thank you.
Well, it looks like we're 5 minutes past when we're supposed to get off, but are there any other closing remarks or thoughts? Or Adrian, what's our procedure from here?
I don't have one planned. I guess we can all say goodbye. But thank you so much for everyone for participating. I'll give a few more seconds if you have any last minute thoughts. Looks like some head shaking now. All right, some waving. Okay, I think that's our cue. But thank you so much, Kyle, for leading this time with us and walking us through how do we confront both ourselves and our history. Hopefully everyone finds some of these tools helpful. I really appreciate you taking time to prepare and lead us through this discussion.
All right, many blessings. May the saints be a guide and gift, a means of grace to you in these days to come.
Cool. Thank you so much, everyone.